The first snow of November fell over the Rockies like ash. It softened the slag heaps in the abandoned shacks that once hummed with the rhythm of drills. Inside the town's only cafe, silence sat heavier than the smell of burned coffee. Men who had spent a lifetime underground now stared at their boots, counting the days since their last paycheck, 83, and climbing. The Great Depression had reached every hollow and ridge in the American West. By 1932, over 70% of mining operations in Colorado had shut down. The price of gold was fixed, the markets frozen, and no one could afford the metal that once defined prosperity. Company officials left overnight. The miners stayed because where else could they go? Their fathers were buried on that mountain. Their sons still played on its tailings. The town that once glittered with promise now flickered on borrowed light. The local store kept a list of unpaid tabs so long it looked like a prayer book. Women stretched sacks of flour through the week by mixing them with barley husks. Children learned to sleep through the sound of hunger. What broke them wasn't just poverty, it was the irony. Every week, trains loaded with government bullion rumbled through the same pass, heading east under armed guard. The gold had come from their own veins, from the rock they had cracked open with picks and sweat. But none of that wealth stayed. In the evenings, the men gathered at the abandoned mill, a cathedral of rust and echoes. They spoke little, but every word carried weight. They weren't outlaws, not even rebels. They were fathers trying to make sense of a system that could value gold over life. Old Tom Bracken, foreman before the shutdown, said it best. The mine fed the world, now it won't feed the men who built it. Outside, the whistle of the next train cut through the cold like a reminder. Gold was still moving, and they were still starving. No one planned a rebellion that night, but desperation has a way of writing its own script. It began with footsteps crunching over frost. Before dawn, men moved quietly through Prospect Ridge, their silhouettes cutting across the fog like memories that refused to fade. They carried no guns, no flags, only shovels, ropes, and the conviction that hunger was no longer a private matter. By the river bend, where the canyon narrowed into the rail pass, the first group gathered. Tom Bracken stood at the front, his coat patched at the elbows, his eyes sunken but steady. Around him, nearly 300 miners, men who had spent their lives in the dark, now waited for the light to return. Word had spread that the Treasury train would cross that morning, bound for Denver, hauling a fortune in gold bricks. To the men of Prospect Ridge, it wasn't robbery, it was reclamation. That gold had been carved from their mountains, traded for paper promises that vanished when Wall Street fell. They built the blockade out of timber and stone, dragging old ore carts onto the track. The sound of iron scraping on frozen steel echoed down the valley like the groan of a buried giant. By sunrise, the canyon shimmered in a pale light. Steam rose from the rails. Somewhere in the distance, a whistle cried out, long, sharp, and certain. The train was coming. Tom looked at his men. "No one takes a thing," he said. "We stop it. We make them listen." There was no greed in their eyes, only a quiet defiance. Some carried photographs of their children. Others wore Sunday coats that smelled of coal dust and candle wax. They weren't thieves. They were men who had run out of silence. The train appeared like a metal serpent winding through the white. Smoke billowed from its stack, curling into the mountain air. As it neared the blockade, brakes screamed. Sparks flared beneath the wheels. When it finally stopped, the ground trembled with the weight of its cargo. Tons of gold bound for vaults that none of them would ever see. A guard shouted from the locomotive, "You're trespassing federal property." Tom stepped forward, his boots sinking into the snow. "We're standing on our own ground," he replied. For a long moment, no one moved. The wind carried the hiss of the engine and the low murmur of 300 men holding their breath. Then a miner named Ellis, a quiet man who hadn't spoken since his son died of pneumonia, walked up to the car and laid his hand on the side of the train. "This metal was ours," he said softly. "Now our children starve beside it." His words broke something open. More men stepped forward, not to steal, but to be seen. They stood there, fathers, brothers, widowers, a wall of worn faces against a machine built for wealth. The guards hesitated. They weren't much older than the miners themselves. None wanted blood on their hands. One of them, a boy from Kansas, lowered his rifle and whispered, "I got folks just like you." That moment, that flicker of humanity turned the standoff into a sermon. When the sun rose fully over the ridge, its light struck the cars of gold. For a heartbeat, the canyon glowed like fire, the contrast unbearable. Hunger on one side, treasure on the other. The men didn't cheer, they didn't chant, they just watched, quiet as prayer, as if realizing the truth they had chased their whole lives. The gold was never meant to feed them. A bird's cry cut through the silence. Tom lifted his head. "We've made our point," he said. "Now let's see if the world was watching." They didn't know yet that the world was watching, and that before the day was over, the government would call them something they never were. The train sat silent under the mountain light, its boiler hissing like a beast restrained. The men had stopped it, 300 fathers standing in the snow, but none of them knew what to do next. The cold bit through their coats, and yet none stepped back. They had crossed a line that morning, not into crime, but into memory. Steam rolled through the canyon, wrapping the cars in a ghostly fog. The gold inside gleamed behind armored walls, stacked in neat, perfect bars. Each one weighed nearly 27 pounds, worth more than a man's wage for a lifetime. Yet out there among the rocks stood the men who had mined it, their bellies empty, their pride threadbare. The symbolism was impossible to ignore. The train was the bloodstream of a nation that no longer felt its own pulse, carrying wealth eastward while the West starved. Every rail, every bolt, every rivet on that train had been laid by hands like theirs, but now it was guarded against them, like a fortress on wheels. Tom Bracken climbed the embankment to where the engine crew waited under guard. "Tell your bosses," he said, "this train stops until they feed our town." No threats, no weapons, just a statement carved in hunger. A reporter from Denver, having followed whispers of the blockade, scribbled furiously in his notebook. His story would run under the headline, "Miners Halt Gold Train. Call it act of justice." By midday, the canyon filled with echoes. Women and children arrived, bringing bread crusts, blankets, and hope. The blockade turned into a vigil. The men sang old work songs, their voices rough but proud, rising over the steady hum of the stalled locomotive. Then around noon, a side door on one of the bullion cars shifted open. Nobody knew who moved it. Maybe the cold metal had expanded. Maybe a latch gave way. But the moment it did, a bar of gold slid free, striking the frozen ground with a dull, holy sound. It didn't shine the way they imagined. It looked dead, heavy, soulless, like wealth stripped of meaning. The miners stepped back, watching it sink slightly into the snow. Tom bent down, brushed the frost from its edge, and said quietly, "There it is, the world's salvation, and not a mouth fed by it." No one touched it. That was the difference between theft and protest. Restraint born of principle. They left the bar where it fell, a mute witness to the injustice that had brought them there. But the symbolism carried farther than they realized. By dusk, word of the standoff had reached Denver, and from there, Washington. The government saw rebellion, the newspapers saw a story, but in Prospect Ridge, all they saw was a single day of dignity, a stand against a system that measured men in ounces of gold. When the order came down to move in federal agents, the sun had already slipped behind the ridge. The miners didn't know yet, but the tracks they stood on were no longer just steel. They had become a line between law and conscience. The wind shifted, bringing the faint echo of horses and engines down the pass. Tom turned toward the sound, his breath fogging the air. "Boys," he murmured, "seems the government's finally coming for its gold." Night crept down the canyon like smoke. The snow had hardened to glass beneath the miners' boots. Their fires flickered against the black rails, small islands of warmth in a sea of cold iron. They knew the government's men were coming, they just didn't know when. Back in town, the women waited. Lanterns burned in the windows of Prospect Ridge like low stars. In one kitchen, Mary Bracken, Tom's wife, stood over a tin stove, stirring a pot that held little more than water, salt, and ground barley. She set aside a crust of bread for her youngest, then turned to the window, listening for the sound of engines from the valley. Every family had the same ritual that night: a prayer, a candle, a meal that barely deserved the name. But behind every pair of weary eyes was the same thought: if our men fall, what becomes of us? Down at the blockade, the miners huddled around the dying fires. They spoke in low voices about wives, about lost jobs, about the meaning of work. One man, Ellis, rubbed his fingers over a small wooden cross. "My boy was 6, he whispered. "Coughed himself to death last winter. If we'd had medicine, maybe he'd still be here." Tom listened, his jaw tight. "That's why we're standing," he said, "so another father doesn't have to bury his child for lack of a coin." They all nodded. Not one of them had come for glory. They came because hunger had left them nothing to lose. Then came the sound, faint, distant, like thunder rolling through the mountains. Headlights flashed in the fog, federal trucks, carrying armed guards and officials. The miners rose as one, gripping tools and lanterns, the canyon filled with the metallic clang of chains and the hiss of steam. Before the soldiers reached them, Tom turned to his men. "No violence," he said. "We stand, we don't strike. Let them be the ones who can't sleep tonight." In that moment, their courage felt heavier than the gold they had stopped. From the shadows, a child's voice broke the silence. It was Mary's eldest boy, Samuel, who had run all the way from town to warn them. His breath came in clouds. "Mama says the press is here," he gasped. "They're taking pictures." The men turned toward the cameras, glinting in the dark. Black boxes capturing history on brittle film. None of them smiled. They simply stood still, faces lined by frost and firelight, the image of men who refused to kneel to hunger. The flash bulbs went off. The world would soon see them, not as thieves, but as what they truly were, workers who had nothing left but their dignity. But even as the flashes faded, the rumble of engines drew closer. Government men in long coats stepped down from the trucks, rifles slung across their shoulders. A voice through a megaphone shouted, "Disperse immediately. This is federal property." No one moved. Tom raised his hands. "We'll go," he said, "once you swear to feed our families." A pause hung in the cold air. The officer looked down, unreadable. Then slowly he gave the signal. The rifles lifted, the line advanced. In that instant, the women on the ridge screamed. The sound carried like a siren through the dark. Mary clutched her youngest, whispering his father's name into the night. The first shot wasn't fired by anger, but by fear. A spark, a flash, and then chaos. Men scattered, women cried, children ran through the snow calling for fathers who would never answer. When it ended, silence returned to the canyon, broken only by the hiss of the train. Steam rose, glowing red in the torchlight. A few miners lay on the ground, motionless, their breath frozen midair. Tom knelt beside Ellis, pressing a hand to his chest. "Hold on," he said, "hold on." But the words fell into the wind and vanished. From the ridge above, the gold train loomed untouched, the symbol of everything they'd fought for and lost. Tom looked up at it through the smoke and whispered, "They think they stopped a riot, but they just started a reckoning." Morning rose cold and gray over Prospect Ridge. The snow was stained where the fires had burned through the night, and the tracks lay quiet beneath a thin film of frost. The train, still heavy with gold, sat like a monument to silence. Only the echo of boots and orders broke the calm as federal agents moved through what had been the miners' camp. They rounded up whoever hadn't escaped into the woods, men dazed, coughing, some still bleeding from the clash. The reporters were gone, their photographs sent east before dawn. In their absence, the government took control of the story. By noon, Denver papers ran headlines that read, "Miners riot in Colorado. Federal gold train attacked." The word riot cut deeper than any bullet. It turned fathers into criminals, hunger into an act of treason. Tom Bracken and a dozen others were dragged into town and locked inside the old courthouse. They sat on wooden benches under flickering lamps, the same men who once carved tunnels through the mountain, now staring down the weight of the state itself. An agent from Washington paced before them, polished boots, pressed coat, the kind of man who had never worked a day underground. "You interfered with federal transport," he said. "That's sabotage. You'll be charged under the National Defense Act." Tom lifted his head. "We never touched a bar of gold," he said. "Intent is enough," the man replied. Outside, women gathered at the gates, clutching children in blankets. Mary stood among them, her face drawn, her breath visible in the cold. "They're not thieves," she shouted. "They're men who wanted to feed their families." But the officers didn't answer. The world had already chosen its side. The trials began the following week. The miners were paraded through Denver in chains, a public warning to anyone who thought hunger could justify defiance. Inside the courtroom, reporters sketched their faces, careful to make them look dangerous. The prosecution spoke of order, of patriotism, of protecting the nation's assets. The defense spoke of starving children and broken promises. Neither changed the outcome. The verdicts were decided before the first witness took the stand. Tom received 10 years at Leavenworth Prison. Ellis, the man who had lost his son, was given 15. Dozens of others were sentenced to labor camps or county jails. Their families were left behind in a town already half dead. But history has a way of listening, even when power pretends not to. In the following months, whispers spread across the mining towns of the West. Whispers of the Prospect Ridge stand. Union organizers began quoting Tom's words. "No one takes a thing, we make them listen." Letters from miners in Nevada, Utah, and Montana poured in, calling him a hero, a martyr, a man who had dared to hold a mirror to the nation. The federal government tried to bury the story under red tape and silence, but the truth moved faster than any train. Reporters who had witnessed the standoff began releasing their photographs, not of rioters, but of faces lined by frost and faith. One image in particular spread like wildfire. 3 men standing before the gold train, heads bowed, snow falling around them. It was impossible to look at that photograph and call it crime. It was America itself, exhausted, proud, unbroken. By the spring of 1934, pressure from labor groups forced Washington to reconsider how it handled striking workers. The National Industrial Recovery Act began drafting protections for miners, mandating fair wages and safer conditions. Quietly and without acknowledgement, the courage of Prospect Ridge had reshaped the law it once defied. Still, the men remained behind bars. The gold train resumed its route, as if nothing had happened. But in the valley, something had changed. When the rails sang under the next convoy of bullion, people no longer stepped aside to watch it pass. They turned their backs. In her small house by the ridge, Mary pinned the newspaper photo of Tom above the stove. Each morning she lit the fire beneath it, as though the warmth could reach him through the miles. And one night years later, when the train passed again under a full moon, she swore she heard his voice in the echo of its wheels, not defeated but patient. "We didn't fail," he seemed to whisper. "We just ran out of time." Far down the valley, another sound answered, a different train whistle, coming from a direction no one expected. Decades passed, and the mine at Prospect Ridge never reopened. The shafts filled with water, the tools rusted where they had been left, and the rails were slowly reclaimed by grass. By the time the war came and went, only the old remembered the day when a train of gold was stopped by hunger and hope. But memory has its own kind of gravity. In the 1950s, young miners found fragments of the old blockade still buried in the snowfield. A cracked ore cart, a length of chain, and deep in the dirt, the faint imprint of a boot. Some said it was Tom's. Others said it belonged to one of the nameless men who stood beside him. Whatever truth lingered there, it refused to die. In the library at Gunnison, a historian named Clara Jensen discovered a box of forgotten photographs. Grainy images of miners in the cold, the gold train glinting behind them. One picture showed a boy, Samuel Bracken, standing next to his father, eyes wide and defiant. Clara published them in a local journal under the title, "The Stand at Prospect Ridge." The article spread quietly through mining circles, union halls, and veterans' lodges. Men who had once believed they were alone in their struggles found courage in those frozen faces. The story inspired rallies, petitions, and eventually a monument, not grand but honest, a block of black granite set beside the old track, engraved with the words, "They stood not for gold but for bread." By the 1970s, the few surviving miners were old men. Some couldn't even recall the exact date of the standoff, but they remembered the cold, the sound of the whistle, the silence afterward. One of them, Ellis's brother, spoke at the unveiling of the monument. His hands shook as he read from a piece of paper yellowed by time. "We weren't heroes," he said. "We were hungry, but that morning we remembered what it meant to be men." The crowd stayed quiet. Wind whispered through the grass. A train passed in the distance, its modern cars carrying freight instead of gold. No one saluted, no one cheered, but heads bowed as if instinctively paying tribute to those who had once turned steel into conscience. In the years that followed, labor historians traced the echoes of Prospect Ridge through the country's reforms. The 1935 Wagner Act, which guaranteed workers the right to organize, the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938, which set a minimum wage, even the Mine Safety and Health Act of 1977. Every one of them carried, in some invisible way, the fingerprint of that frozen rebellion. Today, the rails are gone. A hiking trail follows the same path the gold train once took. Visitors stop at a weathered sign that tells the story, brief, almost clinical, but those who walk a little farther can still find the old granite marker. If they listen carefully, when the wind moves through the canyon, they swear they can hear the echo of hammers and distant voices. And if they stand there long enough, they might see what the historians missed. That this was never a story about crime or politics. It was about men who drew a line not against a government, but against despair. The train kept moving. The years rolled over them like snow on the tracks. But their stand, brief, desperate, human, bent history just enough to make room for justice. The world may forget their names, but not their lesson. The land remembers the hands that shaped it. And on quiet nights when the moon glints off the rails that remain, some swear they can still hear the whistle, not of a gold train, but of the promise it left behind, rolling endlessly through the mountains of the American heart.